So I read that Jimmy Stewart filmed this particular scene in one try because he was so overwhelmed by the experience of his expressing his love for Jesus that he said, "I have only one of these in me. I'm absolutely serious when I say this is one of the greatest honors I've ever had." That scene brings to life the words of the third verse of Silent Night. Son of God, love's pure light, radiant beams from thy holy face with the dawn of redeeming grace. Jesus, Lord, at thy birth. In a very real and special and unique way, songs and poetry bring to life the magic of love and the dawn of grace. The opening words to the song that the band just sang, Love Came Down. If my heart is overwhelmed and I cannot hear your voice, I hold on to what is true. Though I cannot see, if the storms of life they come and the road ahead gets steep, I will lift these hands in faith. I will believe. I'll remind myself of all that you've done and the life I have because of your Son. Redeeming grace, because the Word became flesh and lived among us full of grace and truth. And so we gather each week to worship, to celebrate the life and impact of Jesus the Christ, the Word made flesh, the light of the world, the dawn of redeeming grace in the world and in our lives. Now here's an interesting piece of trivia. The word grace, anyone have any idea how many times it's used in the Gospel of John? Take a wild stab at it. Close. Closer. 4. All right. It's only used 4 times in the Gospel of John in verses 14, 16, and 17 of chapter 1, which is known as the prologue. Never after that in the Gospel of John. You see, once the Word became flesh, grace is then brought to life in the rest of the Gospel. That is, the entirety of John's Gospel will show what grace looks like, smells like, tastes like, sounds like, and feels like. For John, God, in becoming flesh in Jesus, has committed God's self not only to revealing what God's grace looks like, but that God also wants to know it and to feel it. Now notice that John's Christmas story doesn't say anything about angels and shepherds, seems to know nothing about a young mother or a magi. Indeed, John's story is hardly about the birth of Jesus at all, but instead focuses on the difference that birth makes for all of us. Let me explain. There are, on the whole, just 2 crucial lines that deal with Jesus' birth and what we often call the incarnation. John 1:1 is the first. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The second comes at verse 14. And the Word that was with God and is God became flesh and dwelt among us. And there it is, John's Christmas story. The story of God becoming human, taking on our lot and our life that we might live and love and struggle and die with hope. Redeeming grace. But that's not all that John offers. While John might sum up the Christmas story in just 2 lines, he spends a whole lot of time on the significance of Christmas by shifting attention from Jesus' birth to ours. In fact, John is actually less interested in the birth of the babe at Bethlehem than he is in the birth of you and me as children of God. So listen again to the verses that we often skip over in our haste to get to the close of this 2-verse Christmas story. He was in the world. and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. Did you catch that? Jesus came that we might become children of God. Children, that is, who are not dominated by the circumstances in which we find ourselves, not defined by our limitations or hurts, and whose destinies are not controlled by others. Rather, we are those individuals who know ourselves to be God's own beloved children. Now, to fully appreciate the significance of what John is saying, I think that we need to distinguish briefly between those things that describe us and those things that define us. All too often, I think we allow certain elements of our lives to dominate and define us. Things like our upbringing, our interests, our good experiences and our bad ones, our current marital state or our sexuality, our past triumphs or our tragedies. Now, don't get me wrong, those things matter, and they are what I would call descriptively true. But all too often, we allow them not to just describe parts of our lives, but to define them completely. And in these verses, John invites us to hold all of the ordinary things that describe us as important but insufficient, as valuable but partial, and as meaningful but not definitive. What is definitive, and therefore more important than all the good and bad things we carry with us, is that God has called us as God's own children, individuals who hold infinite worth in God's eyes, deserve love and respect, and will be used by God to care for God's beloved world. Redeeming grace. Can we even begin to imagine that? That Jesus came, was born, lived, died, and was raised again, not simply to pay some obscure penalty for sin, but rather to fully remind us and even convince us that God loves us more than anything. And that reminder is so important that John takes a different tack than all the other gospel writers in telling the Christmas story. We call that first part of chapter 1 the prologue, but why? I mean, what do those opening verses actually do? How do they function? How do they help us to see redeeming grace in our own lives and convince us that God really does love us more than anything? Well, first, they orient, they ground, they introduce, and then they provide a perspective, a default position, a direction. They set the tone, they set out themes so that we know what to expect, a lens through which to view what comes next. And perhaps we all need a prologue for our lives, for our believing, for our discipleship, even for our relationship with God. Now, John, of course, knew the end of the story before he wrote his gospel, and sometimes that really is the only way you can actually write a beginning. But even if we don't know the end of the trajectory of our own lives, we can still choose to articulate that which will anchor our lives, albeit with all of its unknowns. So this is not about having answers. It's about having a sense of alignment and cohesiveness, interpretation, sort of a framework for our life. So if you had to write a prologue for your life, what would it say? What would it include? What themes will orient your life as you look to the future from today on? Specifically, what claims about God that then make a claim upon your own identity will matter for you this Advent season and into the coming year. Another way to think about it, we all act as a character in our life script. But sometimes, and this is extraordinarily difficult, the script gets altered. And it may mean that you have to change it, regardless of how the other characters respond, irrespective of determined dialogue, in spite of suspected disappointment and unmet expectations. It just has to be revised for your own survival. And writing a prologue is an exercise in script rewriting, not only for the sake of how you want to live your life, but how you need to have God as part of that life. Now, working prologue is not about predicting your future. It's not a calculated conjecture of the year's events or even a foolproof plan to face whatever will come your way. Rather, as we take our cue from John, the writer of the fourth gospel, it's about this radical realization that life can't always be the same. And when life cannot be the same, then some kind of determined, incarnated change of direction needs to happen. And that's John's gift to us this Advent, an invitation to invest in our own God stories, our own theological, all that means is thinking with God as part of your thought process, our own theological prologues. You see, our interpretation of John would be absolutely lost without these first 17 verses. What's at stake for John, what matters to John, who Jesus is for John, are all contained in that prologue. And we might do well to imagine our prologues in the same manner. What's lost if we don't set out some sort of God-centered orientation for our lives? What's at stake for us this year? What matters to us? Who is Jesus for us? And what will we focus on, both as individuals and as a church? You see, we walk out those doors on Sunday, and there are people walking in darkness all around us who do not know the redeeming grace of God that tells us we are beloved children of God. Will our prologue, our focus, our vision, our direction help bring them into the light of Christ? With this vision, wonderful vision that we have, which is printed on the door as we come in each Sunday, of being a joyful community, drawing people to Christ, where is our focus, our intention for telling the story about what happens here as a faith community? For 2019, our church council has discerned a focus that will especially reach out to seniors and families in Tanque Verde and Vail, working to connect them to each other, to our existing ministries, and to the redeeming grace of God. It's our call to serve them and to invite them into service among us. And all of us are part of this new communal prologue. Together, young and old, newcomer and long-timer, we simply anticipate birth. Jesus' birth and our birth as well, in the dawn of redeeming grace that reaches the world with God's love. As we approach the manger, may it be as holy as Mr. Kruger found it. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And from his fullness, we all have received grace upon grace. Come, come, thou long expected Jesus. Amen.